I've wanted to give this chapel talk ever since I heard one particular phrase from Mr. Casertano. It was a cold winter day at Millbrook, more than 4 years ago. Mr. Downs was giving me a tour of campus. This was the second time I toured Millbrook. The previous year, I'd been accepted, but decided to go to Proctor Academy instead. This was ultimately a bad decision. Mr. Downs took me into Mr. Casertano's office, which I thought he was doing especially for my tour. I later came to learn that this was just a general part of every tour and I wasn't special, but who knows. But despite this, we walked into his office and he told me this one phrase. You guys might have heard this one. Millbrook students are known and needed. This phrase struck me hard. At that moment, I was at Proctor Academy. I was 14 years old, and I was living away from home when I truly wasn't ready. Up until that moment, I was at a place where I did not feel known or needed. In fact, I felt the complete opposite. And when I left, and Mr. Downs told me, "Don't break my heart twice," I immediately knew I wanted to come to Millbrook. I needed to feel what it was like to be at a place where I felt known and needed. I'm giving this chapel talk because I feel like I have been known in so many different ways at Millbrook through my 4 years here. I sang during arts nights, played tennis, been in many Millbrook productions. However, it is rare to be given the opportunity to speak in front of the school and share a story, unless I wanted to make a 10-minute long story announcement during assembly and have everyone glare at me for the rest of the day. But this is me, and this is, I think, the best way to express myself. So to start with the basics, my name's Jacob Maren. I'm a 4-year sixth former. I'm from a little town called Bethlehem, Connecticut, not to be mistaken with the birthplace of Jesus or anything like that. This is a small rural town with a population of a little under 2,000, which makes Millbrook look like a metropolis. And I've lived there for pretty much my whole life. So when I was in 8th grade, and all of my friends decided to look elsewhere at high school, within 10 minutes of their home, I tried to be an alt teen and go further away than any of them. I decided to make the trek to Proctor Academy in New Hampshire for boarding school. This was, as many decisions are in 8th grade, an impulse decision. But all of a sudden, I was with hundreds of strangers in a state I'd never visited, without the comfort of my parents or my home. I met my roommate, a kid named Cole, whom I had been talking with on Facebook Messenger for over a month. And the next day, as they do at Proctor, we were sent off on a 5-day backpacking orientation trip in the White Mountains. To put this all in perspective, I was 5 feet tall, weighed roughly 100 pounds, and was carrying a backpack that weighed more than I did. We took an exit off of I-91, and all of a sudden, reality set in. I was without my parents. I was in the woods, in the middle of nowhere. I had no markings, no signs of where I was, or anything that I could do to ground myself. All that I had was my heart, beating as if it were going to come out of my chest. But if I could describe a single instant in my life where I felt unprepared, not ready to take on a challenge, that was it. Hours later, we were still climbing the mountain. It felt like as if I was a zombie, unaware of my surroundings, lightheaded, and out of my element. With 1 mile to go of a steep uphill walk near Mount Washington, I knew I couldn't go any further on the hike. I knew that my body couldn't take any more physical or emotional stress. So in order to make things easier for me, I tried to plan my demise, or something like that. In the distance, I saw 3 stones, arranged like the slots for your fingers on a bowling ball. And I purposely wedged my foot in between the stones. I yelled a little bit for dramatic effect, and toppled down. Pretty much everything I did after that moment was an act. I left the backpacking trip because of my injury, and immediately had to have my foot on ice for hours at a time. It probably was more painful than the hike would have been. And for the next few days, I had to pretend like I was in excruciating pain. This is actually probably where most of my acting skills developed, actually. So, every time the athletic trainer or the nurse asked where the pain was, I would point to the same spot. And after I recovered, the acting did not stop there. The students from orientation came back as a tight-knit group, one that I felt that I could fit into, but I didn't. I was absolutely not known or needed. Instead, I tried to pretend as if I was known or needed somewhere else. During the semi-formal dance, I talked on my phone with my parents, or sometimes with no one on the other line. It was not for sympathy, and I never wanted sympathy, but it was as if no one made me feel secure within myself. However, despite all of this, I would do what I needed to get done. I coped. I would go back to my room every day, and my roommate Cole would be in there with a knife and a bunch of twigs. I never really figured out what he was doing with them, but all I know is that we had to vacuum at least twice a day with the amount of twigs that were all over our room. At least I did anyway. Maybe it was a project that he couldn't complete. And I had no assertive ability to tell him to stop. I couldn't go anywhere with making myself feel invisible. So what do you do and where do you go when you have nothing to call home? Throughout the year, I'll talk to my mom about this very question on the phone. I was in many different moods when I called her, occasionally happy, sometimes ridden with the stress of homework, but mostly I just felt lost. And most of the time, I just wanted to tell my mom that I was going to give up. But she kept on telling me the same phrase that kept me going. And because my mom is a memoirist and a novelist, I always knew it would be good advice. She said, "Pull out a notebook and write down this phrase." And word by word, she told me to write, "Don't quit 5 minutes before the miracle." And I lived by this quote for the rest of the year. Instead of trying to get sympathy, I did everything that I could to connect myself to home and to try to develop myself in order to connect to home. I started reading my mom's books. I started to read other books. I started to write a novel that I eventually scrapped after 50 pages because somehow I realized that I was in high school and I had no skills of writing whatsoever. Along with reading, I decided to try my hardest with academics and sports and move forward with who I wanted to become. And before I knew it, I left Proctor and started at Millbrook. Looking back at it now, I wish I could tell myself many things about what I would be like on the other side. I want to tell myself that I would be a different person, that this would be actually the biggest transition I've ever made in my life, and that it would actually be for the better. I knew I would have been a different person if I hadn't gone to Proctor. And I now know that I wouldn't be the same Jacob that I've been at Millbrook, a place that I felt known and needed ever since arriving on campus, as Guillermo said before. A lot of times I've shared part of this story with friends of mine at the Common Application and the strangers that read my application at college admissions. At first, I shared this story because I just thought it was a hard experience, and I was happy I was through it. I could just cross that year off as a bad year and move on. But what I later came to realize through pieces of this story is that the skills I developed during my hardest year of my life are the ones that have gotten me through high school. The ability to feel comfortable in a new environment, something that I hadn't had to deal with going to the same school for 10 years, is a skill that I will use in college next year and beyond. I developed passions for reading, writing, and developed a taste in music. I have ways to cope with a hard first world problem. I now know that I will not feel known and needed everywhere I go like I do here, but when I don't feel like that, I now know how to handle it. But most importantly, I've developed an identity that best represents myself, or I feel that best represents myself, or I think. I certainly know that this will not be my only transition. This will not be the only hard stretch in my life. I'm only a senior in high school. What do you expect? But I now know and have the skill to not quit 5 minutes before the miracle, because the miracle will be always worth it. Thank you.